We're looking into a homicide that occurred in Pleasanton in 1984.
Cold crime scene. There's no weapon, there's no fingerprints, there's no footprints.
One of them had said, "Hey, let's tie Tina to a tree and stab her."
She was in constant dismay, just wanting to know what happened.
The FBI agent says to me, "Do you want to know who killed Tina Fales?"
It's pretty outrageous to think you can commit a murder and get away with it. Well, today that's not really the case anymore. There's a DNA database, everything is recorded, whether we like it or not. And our activity can easily be tracked online. But back in the 1980s, the story was quite different.
The tunnel itself seemed like crossing into another dimension. Once you got halfway, you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black.
Bullying could get really harsh back then, and there was little awareness of it, let alone a system that protected the bullied. And in the case of Tina Fales, one day it took a turn for the worse, the very worst. One day, she vanished without a trace. Tragically, her family came to accept the fact that they will never know what happened to their daughter. But almost 3 decades later, a rookie detective found a strange clue in a photograph, and the jigsaw fell into place. Warning, this video can be a trigger to all those who were bullied. Without further ado, let's dive in. Our story begins in Pleasanton, California in 1984. It's a rich East Bay suburb, and in the 1980s, it was on the rise, as lots of business parks and tech buildings were opening up in the area. Oracle, Safeway, and Gap Incorporated remain some of the leading corporations in the area, and they started out in Pleasanton in the 1980s. So even 4 decades ago, the children of Pleasanton grew up in a peaceful town with little crime and full of promise. No one batted an eyelid over their children playing in the streets. In fact, sometimes the streets were better than home. Tina Fales was born in 1970. She grew up with her mother Shirley and her younger half-brother Drew. Shirley had divorced the kid's dad when they were very young, but now she was dating someone much younger than her, a 20-something called Keith.
I didn't care for Keith much at all. He was 15 years younger than my mom. He was in his early 20s at the time.
But that was the least of his problems.
He had a pretty bad temper.
He started drinking heavily. He had been violent toward Shirley.
Imagine having a stepdad who's young enough to be your brother and who drinks all day long and abuses your mother right in front of you. This was a difficult home to grow up in for Tina and Drew. But at 14 years old, Tina was already her own person. She was working at a 7-Eleven after school, and whenever she had the time, she would also clean houses for some extra cash. Whether that was her being resourceful or she just wanted to be away from home, we might never know. In April 1984, Shirley made Keith move out of the house. He was causing a lot of issues, and she was ready to at least take a break from his horrible behavior. But that same month, something terrible would happen to Shirley's daughter. In the fall of 1983, Tina started high school. In April of the next year, she was still a freshman, and even though 6 months had passed, she couldn't really say that she fit in.
They find out that Tina was being bullied at school. She used to ride the bus home, but several girls on the bus were picking on her. They were threatening to beat her up.
Can you imagine being bullied so badly that you can't take the bus to school anymore? How did the teachers ignore this? Was no adult aware of it?
Tina could no longer ride the bus. She had to go through the culvert. It was like a swamp. It felt spooky.
This was a very unsafe road to take as a 14-year-old to and from school 5 days a week. But as far as Tina was concerned, she had no other choice. She just went on with it. Her only promise to herself was that as soon as she finished freshman year, she'd transfer to another school. But on April 5th, something was about to change her life forever. She would never get the chance to change schools. When she got to school in the morning, chaos had already ensued. A boy named Rob Tremblay had brought alcohol to school, and within a few hours, a lot of students were drunk. Of course, what else to do on a boring school day when you're 15? Unfortunately, fueled by alcohol, the bullying got worse. A couple of boys, led by an obnoxious guy named Jeff Michelson, had picked up another boy and locked him inside a dumpster.
According to eyewitnesses, on the day of Tina's murder, a kid named Steve Carlson was taken by Jeff and thrown into a dumpster. And they locked him in there for about 10 minutes before a teacher came and let him out.
Imagine what that must have felt like. Jeff Michaels was not a pleasant person.
He was known as the bully that picked on other smaller kids.
Great attitude, Jeff. Usually these kind of bullies are being bullied themselves by an older sibling, a parent, or someone who's stronger and more authoritative than them. So they end up taking on the weaker, defenseless people. That might be an explanation, but it's not an excuse for behaving like that. That day, the bullying didn't just stop at Steve Carlson. The group of girls who bullied Tina cornered her and started throwing rocks at her.
I think that day one of them had said, hey, let's tie Tina to a tree and stab her.
Tina ignored them as much as she could and managed to get away from the group. But as she left, one of them taunted her that they would find her and beat her up at the end of the day anyway. Somehow, Tina also got detention that day. The reason? She was often late for her morning classes. Well, she was late because the bullies would hold her prisoner or because she was avoiding them, coming to school late on purpose so as not to run into them. Still, the teachers turned a blind eye to this sad reality and punished Tina for her tardiness. But the bullies had detention that day too. So when the classes were over, Tina simply walked home. She didn't care for detention if it involved being cooped up with these terrible girls again. She took her usual route through the huge drainage pipe that led to the gully under Interstate 680.
The tunnel itself seemed like crossing into another dimension. Once you got halfway, you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black.
Tina walked into the drainage pipe and she never came out.
I remember every bit of that day like it was yesterday. I came home from school and my sister wasn't there. On a typical day, she would get home before me, watch over me, and she'd help me with my homework.
From the very second Drew saw Tina wasn't home, he had a gut-wrenching feeling that something had gone awfully wrong.
Another hour passed by and she still hadn't come home. I remember riding my bike out in the court. I remember an undercover police car that came down the street. Right away, I knew something was up. I just felt like it was going to stop at our house. And it was the next day that I found out from my parents what had happened, that my sister was killed.
Tina had only been dead for a few minutes when someone spotted her body.
A truck driver's driving through Pleasanton on the freeway looked over to his right and saw what he felt was a person in distress or possibly harmed.
From the distance, the driver thought that he saw someone who had slipped and fallen on the rocks, or perhaps felt sick and had to lie down. So he rushed down the drainage culvert, but as he was getting closer, he saw blood mixed with the water. The closer he got, the grimmer the reality became.
Realizes there's a dead body down in the creek.
And it was a young girl. She was defenseless. There was a school book next to her. When the driver looked up, her school bag was on top of the tree right next to her. Tina had been stabbed 44 times so viciously that she died within a minute or two. Barely holding it together, the truck driver called 911.
I always dreaded getting a notification call like that. Somebody killed a little girl. It was a very cold crime scene. There's no weapon, there's no fingerprints, there's no footprints. Officers noticed a purse suspended in a tree above the body.
Luckily, a crucial clue was inside the bag.
They found a report card that had the name Tina Fales on it, freshman at Foothill High School.
Now, the police had a starting point. Tina's body had been discovered just after 3 p.m. that day, which meant she was walking home from school. If somebody knew something, it was probably someone from Foothill High School. There was something else the officers knew from the very first day.
Another thing that was noted by the coroner was that there was probably no hilt or guard on the knife because there was no marks or indentations on the body. At some point, we felt that in the course of stabbing Tina, The suspect's hand would slide off of the handle because there's no protective guard onto the blade and actually cut themselves.
So when the officers headed to Tina's school, they were on the lookout for people with fresh cuts on their hands. But the officers knew this was just a suspicion. They basically had no clues apart from Tina's name.
There was very little to go on, so we had to rely on talking to people.
But you know how teenagers are especially reluctant to talk to authorities. They're afraid of getting in trouble with the police, with the school, and with their families. So it's pretty hard to get a high school student to talk. Even harder if they're somehow involved in a crime. Still, the police had no choice. So on the morning of April 6th, they went to Foothill High School and began interviewing anyone on site. Soon enough, a story began taking shape. Tina was being severely bullied by a group of 4 or 5 girls. This was a pretty good lead, especially since one of them had suggested tying Tina to a tree and stabbing her on the same day she got murdered.
The day Tina was murdered, the girls that taunted Tina had thrown rocks at her.
How could that be a coincidence? Needless to say, as soon as the cops found out about the girls, they found them and interrogated them. Strangely enough, it was a coincidence.
These girls were questioned. They did share that they didn't like her for whatever reason, but that particular day, the girls were actually in detention.
Yeah, they were known as some of the school's worst troublemakers, so they were in and out of detention. And since they were in detention on the afternoon of April 5th, this meant that they couldn't have killed Tina, no matter how likely that seemed. Had someone else in their group heard their suggestion of stabbing Tina and done it themselves? Was another psycho kid inspired by their gruesome idea? Again, the police had to go to square one. As they spoke to more students, they heard another strange account.
Shortly before 3 p.m., 2 students were riding in a car. Steve Carlson and Todd Smith. Carlson remarked, "Look, there's Tina Fales," as she was headed toward the culvert.
So, someone could confirm that Tina was seen walking through the drainage pipe and gully, but that was not the interesting part.
Steve sees a male student named Jeff Michelson running through the drainage culvert that goes under I-680 right around 3 o'clock or 3:05 at the time of the murder. Jeff Michelson becomes one of the first big suspects in the case.
The more the police looked into Jeff, the more suspicious he looked. First of all, he was a notorious bully, beating little kids and locking students in dumpsters. Remember, he'd locked Steve in on the morning of Tina's murder. He was violent, impulsive, and had no respect for the other kids. Second of all, he carried a knife.
Jeff carried a hunting-style knife in a sheath that he wore sometimes on his belt.
Who carries a knife to school? And why was he allowed to do so? Anyway, if that wasn't enough, the police also started noticing something on Jeff's hand.
Investigators went to interview him, and they noticed that he had a cut on his index finger.
The cops put 2 and 2 together and figured that Jeff was most likely Tina's killer. They had a witness who saw him at the right time and place. He was a known bully with a knife, and he had a fresh cut on his hand. What more did they need? That day, the investigators got a search warrant and headed to the Michelson house.
They found 2 hunting knives. The hunting knives were sent to the crime lab. They were examined for traces of blood, and they were found to be clean.
No one had expected that. There was no way Jeff could have cleaned the knife so well that no traces showed up at the lab. It was the 1980s, but the technology was advanced enough to determine if there was blood on the blade or not. The cops were shocked, but they had to rule Jeff out as a suspect. As the days passed, the investigators also spoke to Tina's family. Now, with Jeff out of their minds, their eyes fell onto someone else. Remember Shirley's very young boyfriend?
He was physically, verbally abusive. The only time he was ever nice was the night when Tina died. You know, it was unbelievably nice, and it almost seemed suspicious.
And there was something suspicious about the whole story. When Drew had the opportunity to speak to the detectives, he was more than eager to tell them just how horrible Keith was to him, his sister, and his mom.
Keith moved out of the Fales residence because he was creating some family tension in the house.
To say the least, he would literally throw bottles at Shirley in front of her two scared children. And since Tina was the older sibling, she started standing up to him.
A few days prior to my sister being murdered, my sister started yelling at him to leave my mom alone. It made me feel like it could be Keith.
Drew was pretty certain that Keith had killed his sister, but Drew was only 8 years old back then, and the cops couldn't take his feelings as facts. But this didn't mean that the police wouldn't look into Keith Fitzwater. He was definitely a suspicious character, so they traced his activity on the day of Tina's murder. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, his behavior was dubious.
He asked his boss if he could get a ride from him to Shirley's house because Tina had been stabbed to death.
That wasn't the strangest part. Keith had asked his boss if he could hold on to his knife. Just like Jeff, Keith had a knife that he kept in his belt. Before going into Shirley's house, Keith took out his knife and handed it to his boss.
He says, "Why do you want me to keep it?" And Keith said, "I don't want to go in the house with a knife." This certainly was suspicious behavior. You had to think something was going on.
The case felt like Groundhog's Day. Again, the police got a search warrant and obtained Keith's knife to send it to their lab. And once again, the results came back negative. There were no traces of blood on Keith's knife either. You might be excused for thinking the lab wasn't good enough, but it was. Trust me, the biggest plot twist is yet to come. Months had passed and the Pleasanton police were nowhere closer to catching Tina's murderer. Meanwhile, Shirley and Drew did their best to hold it together. But it was very hard not to know the truth behind Tina's death.
I didn't really have anyone to fill the void after my sister passed. My mom did what she could, but she started breaking down mentally. She was in constant dismay, just wanting to know what happened.
Imagine having to live every single day knowing your daughter was stabbed 44 times, but not knowing who did it and why. Tina's memory only lingered on and caused a lot of pain for her grieving mom. But the more pain Shirley felt, the less the police cared about the case. Time passed and there were simply more pressing cases to solve. As with many unsolved murders, Tina Fales became a cold case. But Shirley was far from getting any closure.
As the case gets older and older, she slowly started deteriorating just mentally. She would always have her house spotless. And whenever she'd have these breakdowns, she wouldn't clean the dishes for months. I'm seeing her deteriorate, just go crazy right in front of me.
Sadly, this was Drew's life all the way to adulthood, when finally he moved out of the family home. But moving out didn't bring him much comfort. His mom was in a terrible mental state, and he continued to visit and care for her whenever she was at her most vulnerable. The years passed, and apart from Shirley and Drew, everyone had forgotten about Tina Fales. But 24 years after her murder, someone remembered her. It was February 2008, and a rookie police detective called Dana Savage was going through cold cases in Pleasanton, California.
In the 80s, there were 3 serial killers identified as murdering young girls in the Pleasanton area. One of them has to be the person responsible for Tina's death. Where do we have the best chance of finding something that maybe was overlooked before?
Dana wanted to think outside the box. If it wasn't Jeff, Keith, or the group of bully girls, then it must have been someone else who took Tina's life back in 1984. Was it a serial killer from the area, or someone else close to Tina at that time? Luckily, in the 2000s, cops didn't have to rely on suspicions and theories. They had excellent technology and top-notch DNA testing. But where to obtain the DNA? That's when Dana got a genius idea.
When I'm looking at the evidence photos, there is a purse hanging from the branches of a tree. Seeing the purse up in the tree just didn't make sense to me at all. I think Tina would try and hold on to her purse and possibly try and fight back with it, using it as a weapon. It just really clicked that probably the last person to touch this purse was the suspect.
Luckily, the purse was still in pristine condition, held as evidence in the Pleasanton lab. So Dana grabbed the evidence box and handed it to the FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia.
One day I get a work call, and it's the FBI. The FBI agent says to me, "Do you want to know who killed Tina Fales?" The FBI found 4 drops of the suspect's blood on the purse. This solidified the theory that had gone back for decades that the murderer's hand had slid down on the knife, possibly cutting himself. I wasn't ready for what I discovered.
The killer had cut himself indeed, but it wasn't Jeff. It was Steve Carlson, the 16-year-old student who was once locked in a dumpster. Only now were the police uncovering the great plot twist. It was the bullied, not the bully.
Later, after Tina's body was found, Steve was the first witness officers spoke with.
He told them that he saw a male student named Jeff Michelson in the general vicinity of the crime scene on that particular day.
But that morning, Jeff had locked Steve inside a dumpster. What better way to get his revenge than to frame him for murder?
He was trying to push investigators toward another suspect.
Steve's frustrations ran deeper than the dumpster incident. On the first week of April 1984, Steve's parents left the home to go on vacation. Steve was home alone, so he wanted to throw a monster party at his house.
Steve went to the school and invited other students to come over to his house and drink and use drugs. Nobody wanted to go.
And then later, some kids lock him in the dumpster. And when Steve gets out, he is covered in garbage and food, and he is pissed off.
When he got out of the dumpster, it was thanks to a teacher, but she could smell alcohol on him. He'd been drinking thanks to his schoolmate, Rob, who'd brought the alcohol to school that day. The teacher didn't care about Rob at that point. She said that no one was allowed to drink at school, and so Steve had to go to the principal's office. Steve got even more furious. Didn't she see he was covered in garbage and smelling horribly? He brushed past his teacher and ran home. That's when he found his mom's car and got an idea.
So at that point, Steve returned home to his house and got into his mom's car and started driving around the neighborhood.
Steve tells them that Tina gives him a dirty look, like, "Why are you speeding through the neighborhood?"
This was the last straw for Steve. He stopped the car, got out, followed Tina into the creek, and stabbed her until he couldn't anymore. He took out all his frustrations and shortcomings on an innocent girl who was at the wrong place at the wrong time. What's even sadder is that Tina was on her way home to avoid the bully girls at school. She was caught between a rock and a hard place and met with the most tragic end. Now, in 2008, the police were finally putting 2 and 2 together.
According to eyewitnesses, after the body is discovered, Steve Carlson is seen on the roof of his home watching as police begin their investigation.
It took 3 years for the Pleasanton police to put the case together and get enough evidence for a conviction. But in 2011, Steve Carlson was brought over for questioning. He was already in jail for drug-related offenses and 4 indecent acts with a minor. Watch his reaction when the detectives bring up Tina Fales.
We're looking into a homicide that occurred in Pleasanton in 1984 in high school. Do you remember that? You were in high school. Tina Fales got killed. Do you remember that? Yeah. We're recontacting old witnesses from that case. And we, oh yeah, oh, here you go.
That's right, Steve's body reacted right away to the news, but his mind tried to put up an act, at least at first. He was adamant that he had nothing to do with the murder. Nevertheless, he was arrested, tried, and convicted.
You're under arrest for the murder of Tina Fales.
In 2014, Steve Carlson was found guilty and sentenced to 26 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Tina Fales. Strangely enough, 26 years was exactly how long it took for Steve to be arrested. Sadly, the news of Steve's arrest didn't bring any closure to Shirley. Instead, it brought a bitter end.
On the day prior to the trial, My mom had a massive heart attack.
I think she just couldn't go through the trial and died of a broken heart.
Then in 2020, there was another plot twist. 36 years after Tina's murder, Steve wrote 3 long letters confessing his crimes and apologizing to Tina and her family. He explained his murderous fit as a result of long-term frustration accumulated from school and from home. Drew made a statement following Steve's letters, saying it was nice to finally know for sure who did it, but that it didn't solve what had happened. Moreover, Drew grew up in fear all his life. Deputy District Attorney Stacy Pettigrew commented, "Confessions are always late. The victim is dead and their family is already destroyed. But in Tina's family, her poor mother literally died before she could hear a confession. And Drew has PTSD that he may never fully overcome." It's a truly sad case where bullying and a lot of unfortunate circumstances led to the worst outcome ever. What do you think about this case? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section. Hey, don't be shy, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. See you next time and stay safe.